Good evening, everyone. It's 6:31. I'll bring the meeting to order. First off, I need to read the electronic meeting disclosure. This meeting is being recorded. The meeting of the Board of Trustees of the Village of Enosburg Falls is being conducted electronically in order to ensure the safety of all attendees and to maintain compliance with Governor Scott's executive order. Per H681 signed into law March 30th, 2020, Section 6, there's a temporary suspension of designated physical meeting location requirements of Vermont's open meeting law, VSA Section 312. In order to ensure that all attendees can hear clearly, your audio may be muted. When you wish to speak, you can raise your hand in the participant list or by submitting a chat request, or if you called in by pressing *9. Once acknowledged by the chair, please clearly state your name and then proceed with your question or comment. Please remember that when unmuted, all participants can hear any sounds in your environment. Again, this meeting is being recorded. All right, let's get a roll call. Cindy?
Here.
Jason?
Here.
Heather?
Here.
So it appears that Leonard Sharon is the only absent board member so far tonight. He may be joining us later, but I'm not sure. First up, modifications or changes to the agenda. Hearing none, we'll move on to public comment. There's no one here from the public tonight, so we'll move on to mail-in voter ballots.
Yeah, maybe I can tee this up a little bit. Heather Moore had sent a request last week asking if this could be a topic for discussion this week. So I contacted Andy Bolio, our village clerk, asked him to do as much research on this subject as he could and be prepared to answer questions that the board might have about this for tonight. And my understanding in talking with Andy preliminarily, was there may be some things that the board wants to think about, and maybe one or two issues regarding the state government that could be obstacles with this. But Andy, do you want to give the board kind of the lay of the land on this as you understand it generally?
Yes, the research I have done is we checked some of the local towns around us. Actually, nobody was going with the 100% mailing for the simple reason that they went back to their, when they had the presidential, there was an awful lot of waste. The post offices were loaded with undeliverable mail. And I think that might be a cause again if we try to go. The second reason is we do not have the envelopes at this time to do 100% mailing. Our max at this time would be approximately 300 mail outs with what we have on hand. And checking around, there aren't others available. The printing of these envelopes are done on a schedule by the state, and right now there has been none done.
So you're saying it would, at least according to the checklist that we have, we wouldn't have enough envelopes which are printed by our state government and have to be printed by our state government.
That's correct.
In order to send them out. If we were going to try and do 100%, we can print ballots, but the envelopes that the ballots are going to be sent in have to be the envelopes that are printed by the state. Is that correct, Andy?
That is correct. And that is what we have on hand at this point is enough to cover 300 mailings.
So, Andy, is there?
Yes, Heather.
Sorry to interrupt. Didn't mean to interrupt you. Have you heard of anything about increasing their schedule of doing that? Because the state government is the one that spearheaded this.
As far as I know, there's no scheduling for any more printing of the extra envelopes.
And would we be able to, we'd be able to make our own ballots, correct? That way,
We
it's,
can make our own ballots, and we've also got a notice to be sent out uh, for the people to find out about where to request the ballots, either by email or by excuse me, or by website. And from past experience, I've seen in the past, for an example, this past year, we had a total of 46 people who voted. In the past 3 years, we have had a total of 5 mail-in or absentee ballot requests. So that's what indicates to me that, mailing out 1,000 of them would be a lot of waste.
But
go ahead, Cindy.
Well, I thought the understanding was because of the new legislation with the Australian ballot, it had to be requested. So I'm thinking that the 300 we have is going to be far more than enough. And we
Right.
don't need to waste the postage
If we
and
go
whatnot
strictly
in
by
order to
request.
mail it to every constituent.
Right.
Heather?
so as of, I think, last evening or this morning, it was signed by the governor that state municipalities could mail ballots home to every registered voter. That's brand new. They've been working on it for a little while, but it was just signed into so that we can do it. I mean, there is like definitely the risk of waste, but that we're also areas that sent out voter registration or ballots to every registered voter. They had an increase in participation, which is really exciting, honestly, and it might bring some further conversation of community members participating in what's going on in Enosburg, if we did something like this.
Matt?
If I can contribute to this, if we make the decision to mail to all registered voters, per Andy's last estimate, that's about 1,100 people. It would require an additional cost of about $800. And as he mentioned, would require that we have access to those additional 800 envelopes. Actually 1,600 envelopes. There's 2 envelopes per ballot. So we've got to find a source for those envelopes in order to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. The legislation also came with funding to help support municipalities with the extra cost. I don't know what the details are with that, but it's possible that the extra 800 could be covered.
They cover the cost of the mailing, but that doesn't cover the envelopes that we do not have.
I feel that the recent uptick in mail-in ballots kind of only came from the federal and state level. I wouldn't imagine that too many people would find local government as interesting as state and federal. So I don't think that we're going to see a huge rise in mail-in ballots, but we'll see.
I think if we go by the requests, we'll have the people who are actually interested in what's going on instead of mailing out with an unknown number that ends up in the garbage at the post office.
Exactly. I'm thinking that we just mail people ballots that request them. I feel like it's been made known that this year's different. Everyone should already know that it's kind of different, but I think that we should just mail them to people who request them. That way we won't need to deal with any loops, because there's probably an additional issue with, say there was a registered voter that got skipped or missed somehow. It's probably an issue with that.
Yeah, I don't know how that was addressed in November.
So we would have to address all of our registered voters, and yeah, I feel like it would just, it's a lot. We already have a lot going on right now.
And right now, we've also, there's been talk of sending out these notices to the people with the instructions of where to get their ballots. And we'll be going out with our electric mailing, which will be a savings of quite a bit of money right there.
Yeah, if I can add to that, for clarification, the objective is to try and get that notice informing our electric utility customers that are in the village billing cycle, which should cover a fairly significant number of households within the village limits.
The figure I'm sorry. The
That-
figure I checked out today was approximately 700 plus people in the village that would
Right.
be getting those notices.
And those would go out in the village billing, which the next cycle for that is around February 5th or 6th, those go in the mail.
Right.
So if we make the decision to do that and finalize that notice, then we can get those out into the hands of all of the residents within the village limits. And then the other objective was to get some postings up on our website, on Facebook, and on Front Porch Forum, reminding folks we created a new special email address, which is voting@enosburg.net, where they can send a request for their ballot. And that'll be monitored by all staff in the office so that we can respond to those requests in a timely fashion. And they also have the opportunity to call the office and request a ballot. And we'll set up a simple website request form as well, so we can put links in the Facebook and Front Porch postings where they can click on the link and it'll take them right to a form on our website where they can fill in their information and request a ballot that way. So hopefully that can get the word in front of as many of our voters as possible so that they're aware of the change in the annual meeting process and make those requests for those ballots.
Sounds very thorough.
That sounds adequate to me.
Yeah.
So what does the board think? Should we just not go ahead with mailing every single registered voter a ballot and just continue on the path we're going?
Yeah, I think there's enough information if they're really interested in voting.
Oh, I forgot. There's also the 2 runs in the Courier and the 1 run in the St. Albans Messenger with a display notice as well.
I mean, I would still love to see voting, sending it out to everybody, but I definitely understand that there's some time limitations with the system. And if we don't do it, it sounds like we're doing a pretty good job getting the word out to everybody.
I would say there's plenty of information out there, yeah. Okay. So does everyone agree? Yeah?
I think so.
Can I take that as a consensus from the board and we can proceed with putting that notice in the next village cycle?
Yes.
Good.
Okay, thank you, Andy.
You're welcome.
Have a good evening.
Same. Don't forget to mail in your paper.
Oh, yes, sorry. Okay.
Thank you for your time, and we'll see you later.
Thanks, Andy.
Thank you.
Good night, Andy.
All right, let's move on to 2021 budget discussions.
Okay, so the main part of tonight's meeting is to go through the budget once again, the draft budget, see what kind of questions or comments the board has about that. And we've got maybe one other item I can bring up at the end of the meeting. I just wanted to ask about the dedication, whether there were any thoughts about that for the annual report. Anybody have any thoughts about that right now, or you want me to just bring that up again next week?
I liked Heather's idea last week about the different organizations that contributed this year to a lot of different things in the village.
I'd be happy to kind of like write up like a draft or summary of kind of what I had in mind, if that would be helpful, and have that for next week.
Yeah, that would be helpful for me.
Okay, so not hearing any other suggestions on dedication, we'll bring this up again next week, and Heather will draft something that the board can look at for a dedication. Okay. We've got a few different ways we can handle this. Matt is going to focus on getting all new numbers to the board for next week's meeting for each of the 4 funds that we have within the budget. For tonight's meeting, he's prepared some things that he is going to put on the shared screen for everybody that we can look at. I think 2 of the funds, there wasn't really a lot of comment, and I think probably the consensus is those are in fairly good shape. That would be water and wastewater departments. 2 of the funds are probably going to need a little bit more polishing. Those would be the general fund and the electric department. So I guess I would suggest maybe we start with the general fund and then go to electric while we're a little earlier in the evening and everybody's a little more fresh than we'll be perhaps, an hour and a half from now. Does that sound like a reasonable approach to people?
Sure.
Okay, so let's hit the general fund. There are some things that need to be discussed. I think there's also some items that Matt plans to have on the shared screen concerning the general fund. There were a number of changes that were made, some of which came out of the audit. We did have our village auditors in-house, right in the building with us last week. So they were physically here going through our books, not done with the audit process yet, but there'll be some follow-up still afterwards. But they were here for 4 days last week, Monday through Thursday, and was I think a good sit down that we had with them. But as a result of that, there were some adjustments that needed to be made, which will have an impact on both 2020's budget and also 2021's budget that Matt will go over with you. And there's a few other things too as well that I know we need to discuss. For example, the road paving projects that are all shown in the draft preliminary budget for the general fund. I know last week Sam had asked board members to go and drive the roads and try and make some honest decisions about what you think should stay in that preliminary budget and what perhaps could go under the paving projects. And so why don't we tackle some of those issues? Matt, do you have some stuff you can put up on shared screen?
I do. I just first want to draw the board's attention to the memo that went out in your packet for tonight's meeting that summarized the changes that you're seeing in that draft number 2 of the budget that you also got copies of. So one of the changes the board requested was to remove the plans for capital purchase of a replacement plow truck for the general fund. That didn't have a significant impact on the 2021 budget, but it did have some impact on the tax forecasting for 22 and future years. It includes the addition of a $20,000 annual equipment replacement appropriation, as Sam suggested we draft into the budget. That would start in 2021 and carry forward for future years until some direction was made to change that. It also includes, I guess that's it for the general fund, if we'll do this one fund at a time. There were some other updates that were made and affected draft number 2 that weren't specifically requested by the board. Some small adjustments were made to interest and principal payments when we got our final distribution of principal and interest from our December payments. Had very minimal effects. We made updates to the printing and public notice accounts to include the $1,500 that was just discussed about getting notices out to the voting population concerning the changes in the 2021 meeting process. That did affect all funds. It was distributed across all funds. There's a inclusion of some money to renew the FCC license for the two-way radios. That again affects all funds. That was a relatively small, I think that added $200 and was spread across all four funds. There was a minor update to the maintenance contracts for Harris Computer Software. We got our actual bill for the 2021 maintenance support contract. Workers' comp was updated. We talked about that at the last meeting. The general fund surplus was updated to reflect the preliminary numbers that we had going into the audit process. But as I mentioned in an email on Friday of last week, the auditors are adjusting the interpretation of GASB 84 to have us recognize all of the unused surplus bond proceeds from the 2019 and 2020 paving projects in 2020. What that does is it increases loan proceeds in 2020 and reduces loan proceeds in 2021, which is when we were going to recognize that to pay down future principal payments. So that has no effect on tax rate, but it does increase the surplus in 2020 and will in turn result in a larger deficit offsetting that surplus in 2021. Property tax was readjusted to rebalance the budget. And there was a small adjustment to the Saving Sidewalk project funding from carryover sidewalk appropriation savings once we got the final numbers from 2020 for that. There's a couple other small changes that affected other funds, and we'll talk about those when we get to them. So you received a draft number 2 of the budget, which did overall increase the tax rate for 2021, mainly because of the addition of the $20,000 appropriation for equipment savings. There were, as John mentioned, a couple of other changes that came from the auditors in the review of our 2020 financials that have to do with the interpretation of how we recognize PTO accrued liabilities. There are some rather technical accounting rules associated with that, and I'm happy to go through that if the board wishes. There are some differences in the way that the rules require you to recognize liabilities for future payments to employees for things like unused sick time that carries over at year end, unused vacation time, and unused comp time. And the rules are different for governmental entities using fund accounting than business enterprise entities. And the difference between those two categories is whether or not your revenues are primarily based on taxes, like the general fund, or on user fees, like the water, wastewater, and electric departments. So the general fund is a governmental fund accounting, and the other 3 utilities are enterprise fund accounting. The rules vary slightly. So the impact was most significant on the general fund. Some accrued liabilities that we were carrying at year end for unused sick and other leave time by employees has been reduced because of this new interpretation of that GASB 84 rule. What that means is our PTO expense in 2020 was lowered by about $14,000 for the general fund. That also added to the 2020 surplus. So overall, when we thought the surplus was going to be $19,000, in that draft that I gave you, draft number 2, it's now looking like it's going to be $77,000 and some change. That's the combination of the additional loan proceeds and the reduction in PTO expense. The other significant, well, less significant change is it updates what expenses are predicted for 2021 and future years. So our original budget draft was based on the old interpretation of the rules. So I've updated these drafts to reflect this new interpretation, which in turn, again, lowers a little bit the PTO expense expected for each year, because we always have some folks who carry over, don't use all of the vacation, or excuse me, sick leave and comp leave that they're accrued each year. So those balances at year end will be adjusted upward or downward based on what remaining hours are for the maximum liability associated with payout at separation from employment, rather than based on maximum exposure of future PTO time used. Sorry, I know that's a little technical, but just want to get it out there for the record. So let me show you on the screen what the general fund budget looks like based on these changes as compared to what you saw in the packets that were sent out in advance for tonight's meeting. Everybody see that?
Yes.
Okay. So this column is how the draft stands now with these late breaking changes. This column is what the printed copy you had for tonight should look like. So the net impact was about a $14,000 reduction in the required property tax revenues for the general fund because of that increase in surpluses from 2020. That's really the crux of the change for the general fund. The other changes were some small adjustments here in the wage categories that reduced our estimated PTO exposure for 2021 of about $4,000. And you will note down here near the bottom that there is now this appropriation of $20,000 for equipment replacement that wasn't there before. And I made the assumption that the board might approach it this way, but certainly there's a couple different ways that you could budget for that. You could budget for that as a planned transfer to committed funds, or you can have it listed as an article as a separate appropriation, much like we do for the sidewalk funds that are reserved each year. The main difference being whether or not you have to have voter permission to change how those restricted funds are used in the future, or whether the board has discretion to reallocate those funds. And John, correct me if I misstated that or didn't give the right impression about the difference between whether that's an appropriation or whether that's a scheduled transfer to savings for future use. I think you're muted, John.
Sorry, thank you. Yeah, I think you summarized that correctly. If I heard you correctly, Matt, you're saying you're not putting that under appropriations, or are you?
I did list that as an appropriation, and if you take that route, just remember that you would need voter approval to decide to use those funds for something other than equipment replacement.
So maybe we can just have a $20,000, well, slush fund, as you will, or emergency fund, instead of qualifying it with equipment replacement. We just have it as a miscellaneous type.
Yeah, you'd still run into the same issue, Cindy. The issue being under the the rules for the general fund as opposed to the enterprise funds. In order to have a slush fund or a specific savings account that you're carrying things over from year to year, it's supposed to go to a voter approval. So you'd need to put it in as an appropriation and therefore, voted on, and it would, under normal conditions, you'd see that under the warning as an article in the warning, like you
Right.
do with the patriotic banners and the sidewalk appropriations. Otherwise, what happens is whatever is in the general fund at the end of the year that did not get expended is simply turned over into the next year's general fund budget, and therefore used to offset, whatever expenses you have for the following year and reduce the amount on your tax rate.
Right. But is there a way we could label it such that if, I don't know, something happened in the park and we needed to fix something in the park, or we needed to give money to, say a tornado went through and it took the porch off the Historic Society Museum, and they needed help fixing that, or, there was a pothole that needed to be covered, or, a tire fell off a truck. I mean, any number of things.
Like emergency
Isn't any
fund?
way to word it so we have this $20,000 that can be used for any number of things?
Oh,
Obviously, we can't call it a
you-
slush fund.
Well, I think that the heart of the question is still the same, whether you're calling it a slush fund or a savings account or an appropriation. It's all kind of this, it's the same issue of not carrying it over into the rest of the proceeds for the following year if a portion of it's is not expended. But are you asking a slightly different question? Meaning if the equipment replacement appropriation doesn't get spent, can we just put it into a general slush fund to be used as sort of a rainy day fund or an emergency fund later?
Well, no,
Okay,
just renaming it in general. I mean, obviously, we were going to use it for the things we need for equipment replacement. But if, like I said, if something else comes up,
Cindy, keep in mind that this appropriation was kind of in lieu of replacing the town truck or the plow truck, sorry. So I don't think that we should use this particular $20,000. I think this appropriation should remain the same because it is for replacing equipment from the general fund. So
okay,
kind of the whole.
so, all right. Then maybe we need to add another one, but if that doesn't work, that doesn't work. But I do have a question though on the sidewalks over here that cost more than paving Pleasant Street. Anybody got an answer for that? What part of St. Albans and Church Street sidewalk cost $58,000?
well, I think Gary had put together the estimate to do the sidewalk project. Gary, Can
you hear me?
can you speak to that
I can
question?
hear you.
Yeah. Basically, what I did, Cindy, was just took basically, this is concrete, this is blacktop, this is everything, topsoil, it's all restoration, removing the old sidewalk, putting new sidewalk in, 8-inch sidewalk at all the driveways. That's basically, I just went by the foot price, and that's what I got for the estimate.
And what section is this? This is from like the village
From Village
offices
Drive
there?
down to Church Street up to Pearl.
On the village side or the residential side?
Well, on right here across from our office, from that sidewalk up that's already there, up to Church Street, and then from Church Street up to Pearl. It's
Wow.
about,
Does that make sense to you, Cindy? So you'd
It does
start
make
at,
sense to me.
you'd start at the that four-way intersection where the Route 108 bridge is, and then you'd head west down St. Albans Street on the right-hand side of the road if you're heading west towards St. Albans. And then at the intersection with Church Street, you would stop going up St. Albans Street. You would go right down Church Street to the intersection with Pearl Street.
Oh, so it's gonna go all the way to Pearl Street?
yes.
Yes.
Oh,
or
okay, that makes a
or-
little more sense than,
I
you
think-
know, the
I
one
think-
house length there.
I think it's
No,
about,
no, it's the whole length down that side of Church Street.
All right, got
I
it.
believe,
until-
Cindy, it's around 750 feet, I think, Cindy.
Okay, I would, like I said, it's like, you know, it's a 1/12 of a mile, but, all right, that makes a little more sense. Thank you for clearing that up for me. All right, I'm done.
Okay, so did Leonard just hop on?
Sam, it looks like his phone number, although it's partially masked, but it's muted. And Leonard, if that is you and you can hear us, if you press *9, we should be able to hear you.
Oh, that's, yeah, okay. Raise his hand. I think you need to unmute him again, Matt.
Yeah, with the phone, all I can do is invite him to unmute, but he's got to press the *9 in order for that to actually unmute successfully.
Uh, uh, hmm.
Okay,
I guess there's not much we can do to help him. Leonard, if you can hear us, try and find your unmute button, or I'm sorry, because you're on telephone. Hit *9 as Matt indicated, and then we should be able to hear you.
okay, so in my directions that I read every night, it says, if you wish to speak, you can raise your hand in the participant list. Sorry, or by submitting a chat request by pressing *9. And then it said, yeah. Maybe Matt has to unmute. He's raising his hand right now, so must be that's what that button does.
Well, the *9 then must be raising the hand, and it doesn't give me an unmute. It just gives me an invite to unmute. So I wonder if there's something else he needs to press.
I guess we've never got this far before.
I'll go do a little technical research. I'll get right back to you on this.
We'll carry on for now. Okay, so I guess, actually, Matt, I had a question for you. How much funds do we had in the sidewalk appropriation fund?
So there's $42,000 and some change at the end of 2020. There's a scheduled appropriation assumed for 2021 of $10,000. So if we leave that appropriation in and the voters approve it, and we don't spend it on any other sidewalk activities in 2021, then there would theoretically be $52,000 available during 2021 for use on sidewalk projects.
If I've noticed one thing, it's we have to keep on the sidewalks because we always kind of forget about them until we're on them. So as they come up for repair, I think it's important to do a little work on them. And that's what that appropriation fund is there for.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because next thing you know, we'll have all bad sidewalks and it'll cost millions of dollars.
I think it's been a long time since we did a little bit, I guess, back in the, John can probably tell me, but they did a lot of sidewalks in the 90s, a little at a time, but for some reason that stopped. I think they were doing their own sidewalks for a while, but I think it's changed.
What do you mean? We were doing our own sidewalks?
We have some sidewalk forms, but not very many. I mean, we have a little bit, but I understand back when Lindsay Gates was here, would do a little bit of sidewalks themselves.
I think that's true, but you are going back a ways. I think that
Right.
was back in
80s,
the 80s and 90s. In more recent years, we've been contracting out almost all of our sidewalk work, unless it was something very small. We did have, I think, a few cases where I think we did pour our own sidewalks, but it was because it was just a very, small section. We were just basically repairing some, individual square areas. I remember we did that on Orchard Street and a couple of places a number of years back. But mostly we've been hiring sidewalk out to professional contractors in recent years.
I think we got Leonard unmuted. Leonard, can you hear us?
I am unmuted. It was *6.
*6. Thank you, Leonard.
Good evening, Leonard.
Good evening. I'm trying to get on here on Zoom and it says unable to connect. I've been trying since, almost an hour now.
Well, that could be a local internet issue that you're having, Leonard. I'm not sure, but if you can hear us okay and we can hear you, you can probably proceed just the way you are.
Okay. Okay, fine.
The disadvantage, Leonard, is I'm putting some things up on the screen that you may not be able to see, but I'll try and spell it out and answer any questions you have.
Okay, thank you.
So Leonard, currently we're in the general fund looking at some appropriations such as sidewalks and paving projects.
Yes.
Doing the sidewalk on St. Albans Street, Church Street, on that block right there. So that's where we're at.
So I think it was clear to everybody that project is estimated at $58,000 and some change.
Now, are you back in the general fund?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
And that the maximum available savings would be around $52,000. So that does have some impact on the 2021 tax rate. A portion of that, about right now, $6,000 is assumed to be covered by tax revenues.
I think we should start there and make a decision whether or not we're going to keep that in our projects list. Personally, I think that we do need to update the sidewalks as they come along, because I think when I first got on, there was a lot of sidewalk that needed to be done, and it was really expensive all in one time.
Well, I think we did 900 something feet last in 2019, Sam, and we were, I forget what our number was,
about 55,000.
55,000 for about 900 feet.
So yeah, I don't know how the rest of the board feels, but I think we should keep that one in there.
Sidewalks are good.
Yeah, I think we should keep that. They're in really bad shape over there.
Okay, so I'm hearing a lot of yeses and no's, so we'll just assume that is going to stay in there for now.
Sam?
Yeah.
There's one other thing I'd like to share with the board as you, I think, are probably going to move to a further discussion about the paving projects that I thought might give some useful context for the board members. I'm going to put up a different item on your screen now. And this is what I'm calling no projects or no build option. And if you were to do no projects, no paving projects, no sidewalk projects, and not do the $20,000 equipment reserve appropriation, which is new, this is what your tax rate would look like. Sorry, trying to get the screen share up. Can you see that?
Yes.
So as you can see, the 2019 tax rate was 54.25. The 2020 tax rate was 54.25. If you don't do anything but catch up with the debt service payments, from those last 2 years worth of paving projects, you're gonna stabilize at a tax rate of around 60 cents. And there's a couple of assumptions associated with this. One, that we lower our current reserve balance from around $279,000 to around $200,000 out for the lifetime of the current longest bond, which is 12 years from the 2020 issue. So it goes out to 2032. This assumes no equipment purchases, no special projects, new special projects being financed with debt service, just carrying out the current debt service obligations that the village has. So that's sort of a baseline if you did nothing but keep up with the current level of village services that we conduct on an annual basis, with the assumption that there'd be roughly 2% increase in annual cost and about a 0.2% increase in grand list. So it's sort of like this magic wand that says everything kind of remains the way it is today and carries forward for the next 12 years until we pay off all of our debt service. That's where your baseline tax rate is going to equalize. So I just wanted to give you that for context as you're thinking about how much that new tax rate might be when you add in paving projects or sidewalk projects or equipment reserves in your decision-making process for this year. So I don't know if that's helpful to the board.
Yeah, I thank you, Matt, for putting that graph together. I think that's a useful visual tool for the board to see, you know, how their decisions will impact the tax rate over the next several years. Because as we've talked about in previous meetings, the die is cast in some ways because of decisions that have been made over the past several years with some of, you know, the other larger projects and capital investments that we've made in the community and have chosen to finance. One thing I would point out in the graph, though, which I think also merits some discussion, is as Matt has put this graph together, he's made an assumption regarding the fund balance and leveled that out at $200,000 as a reserve balance by the end of 2032. And from my perspective, I think that is very much up for discussion as to how much of that fund balance the board wishes to tap into. Matt and I had, you know, suggested a plan to you guys. You definitely need to use it. You have to start spending that fund balance. You know, some of that, well, a small amount of that has been in the books for a long time, but a significant amount of that has built up over the past 5 years as we've brought to the board's attention, and it needs to start getting spent down. We can't just hold on to that money. And you know, Matt and I had suggested to you that perhaps this is a responsible way to help spend that fund balance and get it down, is to try and come up with a plan that would help to level the tax rate for the community in the long run. But there's still, you know, a lot of money at the end of 2032 on the table there. So I would suggest that, you know, that's a discussion that the board can have as to how much of that you want to tap into. I personally feel like you could tap into significantly more of that within the next, you know, 10 years or so. But you need to be smart about it. You need to be responsible about it. Don't say, well, we're going to spend $75,000 of that in, you know, 2021, and then another 50,000 of it in 2022, because you know you're going to have additional expenses there. You're going to tap into a very large amount of that super quickly over a couple of years, and then probably what's going to happen is, you know, on the third or fourth year, you're going to have a major spike in your tax rate, which is what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to, use this money in a way that we can sort of smooth over the increases in the tax rate over the next 10 years or so.
And in conjunction with that, you have a graph, I believe, that you received in the printed copies and the email copies of what draft number 2 is going to look like. I will say that the changes we've talked about tonight, the change in the audit handling of 2020's surpluses and PTO handling has changed that number slightly. So that would look like this at this moment with the best known information as compared to the one that you had in your packet. So it did come down a little bit. It's hovering just under 70 cents. This is the inclusion of $525,000 worth of paving done in 2021, $58,000 worth of sidewalk projects in 2021, and the addition of the $20,000 annual equipment appropriation for 2021 and all future years.
Matt, would it be a good idea to get that equipment money from the fund balance? That way you can kind of project an expense over a long period of time and slowly pull from that. And we can always stop when we need to.
Yeah, I guess the difference as to whether or not you make that an appropriation that the voters approve, or make that a committed portion of the existing fund balance. For instance, you have $279,000 unrestricted fund balance at the end of 2019. That's expected to go up quite a bit in 2020 because of the $77,000 surplus we just talked about. We're expecting to use all of the 2020 surplus and a portion of that carry forward balance in 2021, even with this tax rate forecast, brings your fund balance down to 236. If you were to take, let's say, another $120,000 of that and commit it to equipment replacement, it would restrict those funds for a particular purpose, but they would remain in the savings account and be earning interest as opposed to, paying someone else interest for having borrowed it. Does that answer your question?
It does. Going along those same lines, would it be worth using fund balance to pay off existing debt service? Because I'm sure the interest rate on a loan is much higher than on a savings account.
Certainly worth discussion and consideration. There are some of our debt service obligations that can be prepaid. There are some that cannot. For instance, the bond issues, there is no advantage to prepaying. You're going to pay exactly what you're going to pay in interest for the life of that bond, regardless of when you pay it. Some of the commercially financed projects that have higher interest rates could be retired early, and that would in turn lower debt service payments for future years. That's certainly something that I could work up some schedules for the board to look at if you were to commit a portion of those funds to early retirement of debt service, and how much that could potentially reduce your tax burden for future periods.
Okay, and is there any magic number that you guys know of that would be a healthy fund balance, or is it just kind of whatever's in there?
Well, as we said, really, when you have a balance at the end of the year in the general fund, you're supposed to apply that balance to the next year. Now, the village of Enosburg Falls for a long time, even prior to my coming here, has been carrying a fund balance in the general fund at around 6 figures, as far as we can tell. And we've gone back to around 2001 in our research, and that's what we can tell. However, over the last 5 years, I think this was not pointing fingers or trying to, say, well, it was this person or this person that wasn't paying attention. Ultimately, the buck stops with me, and these were things that I wasn't seeing. But I think partially it happened because we've had a lot of turnover with the director of finance position over almost my entire time here. I think Matt is the 7th director of finance that the village has had in about 16 years. And we had 3 in between 2016 and 18, 3 different finance directors. And that was about the time that we started having funds from the general fund not being tracked correctly into the next year's general fund budget. And over that period, we accumulated a pretty fair amount into the fund balance, the reserves within the general fund. It's there now. I mean, there's nothing we can do about it, and we've been talking with the board off and on for a while about this. But we really, we need to come up with a plan to spend that money down. It's there, it's in the general fund, it has to be used in the general fund, but we need to start taking that money down. It was, from what we can tell, it was at around $100,000 in the early 2000s, in between like 2000 to 2005. That's about where it was. So if you're asking what's a healthy fund balance, well, you're not supposed to have any in the general fund. You're supposed to carry it over. We have it there now, though, and we need to find a responsible way in which to start spending it down. We had about $100,000 in the fund that was apparently there for, as far as we can tell, for a very long time. So if you wanted to try to at least get it down to 100,000, I think that would be responsible. There are reasons that we actually could use a fund balance in the general fund. As you guys know, we don't actually collect taxes until almost the very end of the year. It's normally in October when we collect taxes. But of course, we're still accruing money from day one at the beginning of the new year. So we go through almost an entire year of expenses without collecting any taxes to support the fund. And then we collect that money almost at the very end of the year. And the way we support the general fund is we borrow from other departments in order to do that, and then pay that money back at the end of the year when we collect taxes. So it does, to have at least a little bit of money in there, it does help us to, to get to the point in October when we do collect taxes for the general fund.
Go ahead, Matt.
So I want to clarify for the board that there are a couple of different categories for that fund balance. There's restricted, committed, assigned, and unrestricted fund balance. And the difference between those has to do whether or not dollars have been set aside for a specific purpose legally. For instance, there are restricted funds in the Maynard Trust sidewalk. Those have to be used for a specific purpose. They can't be used for anything else. So that $16,000 couldn't be used to reduce debt service or to pay payroll. Those funds have to be held there and only used for the purpose that they were originally designated legally. Then there are committed funds, and those are typically the appropriated dollars, the sidewalk savings reserves, the holiday lighting, the patriotic banner, some of those appropriations that are set each year don't get used in their entirety. And so they build some savings balances year over year. Those again have to be used for that purpose that was designated by the voters unless the voters agree to use them for a different purpose. So those are committed dollars. And then assigned dollars are those which the board has made a decision what they are to be used for. And a perfect example of that is this highway replacement fund of $10,000. Those are dollars that at some point the board said, let's transfer some dollars into a savings account for the purpose of replacing highway equipment. And Sam, like what you're describing with a $20,000 building of a reserve fund for equipment replacement, that could be done by the board and just transferred to a savings account, and then the board can change its mind about what those are used for, and they can become unrestricted. The voters don't specifically have to take action to unrestrict those funds. Then there's the unrestricted fund balance. So out of that $297,000 balance we had at the end of 2019, nearly $100,000 of that, 90 plus, is funds that have to be used for a specific purpose until either the voters take action, there's a change in law, or the board takes a specific action to redirect those funds. So only $189,000 of that is unrestricted and can be used for any purpose that the board and or the voters determine is appropriate. In terms of a minimum balance, if we go back to 2015, we were carrying a $156,000 fund balance. Only about 50 of that was in some way restricted at that time, and $100,000 of that was unrestricted. And as John pointed out, we're collecting somewhere in the order of $500,000 annually in property tax revenue, 3/4 of the way through the tax year. So any funds that you spend down in the unrestricted fund balance are funds that you will definitely be borrowing short term during the tax year under a tax anticipation note, whether it comes from commercial borrowing or comes from interfund borrowing. We're still paying interest to borrow that money to cash flow our operating expenses until the time that we start collecting tax revenues from the voter. I would say that it would be imprudent to lower that unrestricted balance below $50, $75, or even $100,000. That gives you the board some cushion to deal with unexpected expenditures that occur during the year, emergencies such as $20,000 repair we just had to do on a truck, unexpected, unbudgeted. The voters have given you, the board, the permission to make those emergency decisions. But if you don't have any funds in reserve, then you're going to have to scramble to try and go borrow those funds short term for emergency purposes. And that might curtail the board's ability to make a rapid, quick decision in response to emergency conditions.
So I would assume that the sidewalk construction is committed.
That is a committed category, yes.
And so if we were planning on moving ahead with the St. Albans Street, Church Street sidewalk project, the funds from that could be paid for by that fund.
That's the intent, yep.
That would work some of it down right there.
Yep.
As far as a lot of the unrestricted stuff goes, I would rather see debt service being paid rather than funding for new projects. Unless the interest rate for funding of new projects is lower than our current debt service. Because if we were to use, $53,000 of that to pave Pleasant Street coming from unrestricted general funds, you know what I'm saying?
Instead of getting more interest or paying more interest later.
Right. So safely we could work this down to under 100,000, under 75,000, but we'd want to spend that over the next few years though, not all at once.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. And Matt, thank you for the the more detailed dive into the differences between, the different kinds of funds that we have in the fund balance that we're showing there. So maybe that'll make things a little bit clearer to the board as well. But yeah, I mean, the trick to this is to find a way to do this responsibly. As I said, I guess when Matt and I started talking about it, our approach was to try to find a way that we could perhaps help cut off a large spike in the tax rate, years down the road, and sort of soften the blow that way to normalize it. But, as the saying goes, there's more than one way to skin a cat. And, how much you dig into that, I think is a discussion for the board. I am very comfortable seeing that fund dip down to, 50,000. Some people may disagree with that, but I think I'm fine with that myself, which means maybe you want to dip into that further to try and keep the tax rate a little bit lower as the years go on over the next 10 years or so. But, that's a call I think that the board needs to make. You may want to think about it a little bit still. These are some ideas that we've thrown out to you, some things to think about. And, if you do want to think about it a little bit, I think that's okay. But there's at least a model, a draft for you to look at here and think about where your comfort level is.
Would it be better not to do anything with it this year since the tax rate is level and dip into it when we need it to keep the tax rate level?
We've already predicted to use some of that reserve for this year in a couple of ways. As Sam described, we're using $52,000 worth of those reserve funds specifically for that sidewalk project. We're also planning to run a deficit in 2021 with these assumptions in place. So we're going to be lowering that fund balance to $236,000 by the end of 2021. So if you were to rebalance that so that you were using none of that reserve balance in 2021, your tax rate jump would be quite high for 2021.
I mean, not drop it down to 50 until, just take out what you need to keep the rate level.
And that's kind of what this graph is trying to do is, we know we've got to have some gradual increase just because of commitments that have already been made, whether it, goes to 69 cents because we're doing all these new projects, or goes to 60 cents doing no projects. You're going to have some increase, and the goal, as John said, was to do that gradually over 2, 3, maybe even 4 or 5 years if you wanted to soften that percent increase each year. But in the end, whether you stabilize at a minimum fund balance of around 200,000 or you stabilize at a minimum balance of around 100,000, that's only going to make a difference of about a penny in the tax rate over the period of time we're talking about, a 10-year span.
Matt, you said there was already an account that somebody sometime had made for highway equipment, that there's $10,000 in change in.
Yeah, that fund actually grew out of a couple of things, Sam. It grew from dollars that were collected as a result of selling scrap, and also from some
I believe it was a truck sale, I think, Matt.
It was a truck sale that goes way back. I'd have to go back into my research, but I think it's around 2005 or something like that.
If not later.
There was about $16,000 that came from a one-off asset sale. And then there's some small amounts that were kind of earmarked and put into that savings account over the last few years. It's been pretty stable for about the last 5 years.
And that's a restricted fund?
No, that's a committed fund. So the board has authority to determine how those dollars get.
Okay, so my suggestion would be if we can, so I just want to see a fund that gets roughly $20,000 into it a year for specifically for highway equipment replacement. That way, when it comes time to buy a new truck or something, we'll have the money there. So would it be too much of a hassle to move some unrestricted funds into that committed account to make up the 20,000 for this year? That way we won't have to budget for it.
Not at all. And the way that that's been handled in the past, more often in the other enterprise funds and in the general fund, is that the board has said, we're going to budget a transfer to savings of X number of dollars for future truck replacement. For instance, the wastewater department does that each year. They budget to transfer a certain amount from unrestricted fund balance into a assigned fund balance. I think they're moving $2,500 toward the future purchase of a vac truck, and it's maybe $1,000 or $1,500 each year toward the future replacement of the pickup truck. So that's a tactic that has been used and can be used. It just means designating an entry on the budget says transfer to savings for equipment. And that's an action the board takes when they approve the budget and those funds become assigned. But at a later date, the board can take an action and say, we've built up $40,000 in equipment replacement and we really need to do this other project. You can take an action to reassign those funds, send them back to unrestricted or reassign them for a new purpose.
Okay. So instead of budgeting for an allocation this year for the $20,000 equipment fund, equipment replacement fund, I think we should just shuffle some of those unrestricted funds into that account that's existing. I didn't know we already had one.
Yep.
That makes sense. I think the taxpayers will, it'll feel better for them.
So we can get rid of that off of our tax rate forecast. And we also, I don't know how the board feels, but I think we should take the sidewalk this year out of that fund.
Yeah, that was already planned.
Oh, okay. It wasn't shown on the tax rate.
Yeah, if you look at the last page of the general fund budget, you'll notice it transfers from and to savings. And there's a negative number there. That means we're pulling funds out of the sidewalk savings fund and applying them to that project.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so now we only have like another 190,000 to get rid of.
All right, well, I have one.
right.
The last few meetings, it's been drilled into us that Depot Street belongs to the state. So doesn't the state have grants or something in order to fix state streets? Why would we need to pave it? Also, we just fixed it in 2020. I don't think we need to pave it in 2021.
So that's a class
Yeah.
2 road, and I believe there are grants available. Gary, you may be able to speak more to this.
Yeah, I can answer this, Cindy. It's a difficult problem, and it's something that a number of us talked about over time. There are class 2 paving grants available from VTrans. Depot Street is listed as a class 2 road. We have a lease, as you know, for that road. Our lease agreement says it is our responsibility to maintain the road, even though we don't own it. Why did that happen? It happened because the state said, well, yes, we understand we own it now because we're taking over all this property. When it was decided that the Missisquoi Valley Rail Trail would become a Rails to Trails program, but Vermont said, we're not gonna take care of that street though. And so who else would do it? Nobody except the village. So we signed the lease agreement back in the 90s to accept responsibility for care and maintenance of the road. We attempted last year, or actually it was for this year, it was for 2020. We submitted I'm sorry, it was last year. We're in January now. So last year in 2020, we did submit a grant application to VTrans Class 2 road paving program. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, that grant program was canceled by the state last year. So they did not award anybody any grant funds out of that program last year because of the pandemic and the financial complications it created for the state. It is unknown right now whether the state of Vermont is going to reopen the Class 2 paving grant program again this year or not. We simply don't know. It's very possible they won't. I haven't heard a word from VTrans about it so far, which makes me suspect maybe they're going to cancel it again for 2021. In the meantime, the road continues to deteriorate. It's in pretty rough shape now. So as staff, we had a discussion about, what can we do? Should we at least put it in the budget to see about whether the board would be in favor of this or not? I think I talked with Sam as well back at the end of summer, back in August or so, to see whether this would be poorly received if we did this or not. And he agreed it was worth at least putting in there so the board could see what it would look like in the tax rate. So we did that. But like everything within our budget, it's at your discretion as a board. If you feel like you'd like to take Depot Street out and take the gamble that the state may, in relatively quick period of time, bring back the Class 2 paving grant, and we would get funded. That's the other thing, is you can apply. It doesn't mean you're going to get it, though. The state could turn your application down. In this case, we never found out whether they were looking at a favorable decision on our application or not, because they just canceled the program. So we never got any feedback from them about whether they were thinking this might be something they would fund or not. But I fully agree with your feelings and your sentiment that this is a state-owned road, and shouldn't they be helping us, pave this thing? I am 100% on board with that feeling, which is why we put a grant application into them. And I had done some phone calling around to some people at VTrans to let them know we were doing this, and also let them know that I expected this to be funded, and I wanted a good explanation why it was not going to be funded if they decided to turn it down, because it's their road, it's not the village's road. And we'd still have to come up with 20%.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's an 80-20 grant. So they still, even if they approved it, they wouldn't be funding 100% of the cost on the road. The village would still be picking up 20% of the cost on it. But as I said, the pandemic hit us last year and the world changed. So we decided to, see what you guys would think if the village took on the project on our own, even though it is a Class 2 road and eligible for that program.
Go ahead, Gary.
Cindy, also Railroad Street was also a state-owned road too, and we paved that last year. I don't know if you realize that or not, but Railroad Street is also owned by the state of Vermont.
I always thought that was just Ace's parking lot.
No, that is a town road, but it's also owned by the state. But the reason I picked Depot Street and Pleasant Street, because lately it's been heavily traveled by heavy trucks. All the trucks now are taking Depot Street and Pleasant Street for in and out of Franklin Foods. So it is getting hammered pretty hard by heavy trucks. So I figured of the two streets, those are the two ones I wanted most because of the more traffic on those two streets.
Yeah, just to be
So
fair
if
though.
we do repave these, are they going to be graded to accommodate the new weights, the truck weight?
Well, all we're going to do,
There's not supposed to be any of those on Orchard Street.
Yeah, I know. But what basically wasn't doing that one is basically mill it and overlay it and which would give us a little more thickness. Only mill it a little bit, shim it, where we have a lot of low spots. The street is very low. And that's why we're getting a lot of puddles, because it's got settlement and there's no place the water go because it's so flat. Once we get this milled and get it shimmed, it may have better drainage. We did that patch in front of the Legion yet this spring, just to get that big puddle out of the way, and that was just kind of a Band-Aid until we got the whole thing paved.
Yeah.
That was
I just want to make one point if I can. It's not only Franklin Foods where
right.
that's causing this heavy traffic. It's also the Jolly Store, Bates, Ace Hardware. All of those businesses are contributing. Bluins.
Down.
Yeah. So there's
Understand.
several businesses that are contributing to that traffic down Depot Street in Pleasant.
As long as our roads are paved for those specifications. I mean, if it's just for car traffic, then we're just wasting our money. Because paving the road should last 10 years, right?
Well, I believe that paving was done. I don't know, John, can you get a date on when that last street was done?
I don't know the exact date, but if memory serves, I believe I was told the last time Depot Street was paved was 1993.
So we got over 10
Okay,
years.
I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying if we're paving them now and we know they have a lot of truck traffic on them, then we need to pave them to accommodate that kind of traffic.
Well, I mean, we'll have a total of 4 inches. I mean, highways have 7, so we're not gonna put 7 inches. Not any street in any city has 7 inches of paving. We should have 3.5 to 4 inches, which I don't think there's a lot of heavy traffic, just a lot of repetitive traffic.
Is there any word on the Tractor Supply route to the?
There will be no. I don't believe there's
No.
going to be one, and
No.
I don't know if John knows any different, but I don't think there's going to be any truck route from Tractor Supply.
Well, it was not, I can tell you it was not required as part of the project through the DRB's permitting process. I don't know what the Act 250 results will be. They still need their Act 250 permit from the state, but I wouldn't say anybody should really count on a new road being built as a part of the Tractor Supply project. It's, as I've told people before, it's far more complicated, I think, than the typical person realizes. And it's not even, I mean, there's another property owner in the middle of that too, that you would have to either buy the land from or, you know, negotiate some kind of right of way that has nothing to do with any of that. It's not just Pomerleau and Franklin Foods. There's another property owner in between there. So, I mean, it would be really expensive. Just the permitting process to go through those wetlands would be quite an endeavor. So, you know, I'm just being honest with you. I'm not real optimistic that anything is going to be required through the permitting process for Tractor Supply to have to build an extension into Franklin Foods property.
Okay. So would it be advantageous for us to fund some of this paving project out of unrestricted funds? This year?
So you want to take some of that unrestricted fund balance and use it towards 2021's paving projects? Is that what I'm hearing?
That or Sam, if you want to cut some of these projects out for another year, I mean, that's up to you guys. It's, you know, if you want to.
I don't anticipate being all of them.
No, I mean, 1 or 2 of them. I'd say, you know, like for now, say Ziscoy or Church, that would knock out 150, 190,000 of one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. You guys want to go through that now? Which roads we think we should keep? That should keep us busy for a minute.
I drove on them.
I think we should keep Depot
I
for
think
one.
we need to keep it, though. That thing is blasted and there's a lot
Really bad.
So
And I think we should finish Pleasant Street, get that finished, that to that section, have that whole section done.
Yeah, so it's all more in time frame.
Yeah,
that was just the top section.
Yeah, that's like the last, I don't know, it's like 52,000. I mean, it's how many feet it was, but it's that short run. From,
Lower Pleasant is pretty bad too, but it's
Yeah.
not even on the
yeah, that'll be
not
on,
even
on
on the
the list yet, but let's get the upper one done.
yeah.
I didn't find Missisquoi to be terrible until you get past the intersection of Missisquoi and Pleasant. There's not a lot of traffic down there,
No.
but it's still kind of bad towards the end. It's half dirt, half pavement currently.
Right. Yeah. I think we spread some coal pat or some hot mix down there we had left over this summer just to fix what holes there were.
Gary, is there any way that you can get an estimate on how much just a couple inch overlay would be from the intersection of Pleasant back towards Good Use to where the pavement ends?
I can figure that out. It won't take long. I can figure that's why I use the units from ECI to figure this budget. I can go back and fix it or what it was. So you're saying from the intersection of the church down to where it paved down the bottom of Good Hughes Hill there?
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I can work on that tomorrow. I can get you a rough number.
Okay. I don't know what the rest of the board thinks, but well, let's talk about Missisquoi. I don't know if
I think some parts are bad and some parts aren't as bad.
yeah, it was kind of mixed.
yeah. I think that we can get along for at least this year by patching the rough spots. I found one like right in front of Cold Hollow Career Center's driveway was a little bit rough right there, but the rest of it didn't seem bad to me.
Right.
So I suggest taking Missisquoi Street out entirely for right now, and then Gary, if you can get us some figures from
the intersection back down towards Good Hughes.
Yep, just like an overlay, nothing.
Yeah, like an inch and a half over like we usually do.
Yeah. What you mean, like grinding it and then?
Well, yeah, grinding it, and they usually they shim it and overlay it.
What if you don't grind it and just overlay?
You can overlay it. They'll shim it and overlay it. You can do that. They'll mill the end so it matches in, like at the corner of Pleasant and Missisquoi. They'll mill it in so it matches, and then they'll overlay, say, an inch and a half or whatever.
Okay, because what I've noticed with certain roads, especially ones that take heavy traffic, sometimes like that one, is it tends to show where ruts have compacted.
Right.
I don't want to experiment with this little section of road because it does get some heavy traffic, but I think if we were to just shim it and overlay it,
yeah,
we can keep our compacted spots instead of milling it and then
I think when I originally did that, I didn't think on milling that whole street. I think I did from that intersection just overlaying that, not to mill it.
Okay, so what we'll do right now is we'll cross out Missisquoi Street altogether for right now, and we'll get a price back on just a shim and overlay from the intersection on.
Okay.
If there's no objections from the rest of the board.
I think it's fine.
Sounds good.
The
So-
other one,
How did you
Can
want to,
Go ahead, Matt.
how did you want to describe that in the project list? What do you want to call that?
just a shim and overlay, I would say.
Missisquoi Street, lower Missisquoi Street, maybe. Lower.
Yeah.
Just a point of clarification. So you're not really saying eliminate it. You're just altering the project to do about half the road rather than all of it.
Not even half, I don't think, John.
Yeah, it's just a kind of an extension, but no, for right now, I'm saying eliminate it entirely.
But you
Just
don't want to,
repair.
for next week's meeting, you don't want to see it placed against the tax rate. You just want to see an estimate alone.
Yeah, I mean, either way, I thought for the ease of simplicity, we would just eliminate it altogether because again,
Okay.
it's not a highly traffic area. So if it won't affect the tax that much, then I don't think that there'd be a reason why we shouldn't include it. But I think for right now, we just scratch Missisquoi Street altogether, and we'll just wait for a quote and see what that is.
Okay.
Are you trying to think of like time frame wise, because that would be our fourth meeting?
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about what your real intent, I guess, here is. Do you really want to take it out? And you want to see the estimate in thinking about perhaps next year's budget to do that shim and overlay next year for the intersection down to Good Hughes? Or are you honestly considering still maybe doing that part of it for 2021?
I would consider it. I'd like some
Okay.
feedback from the board on that. I don't know what you guys think, but
So Sam, I think that we probably want to see the reflected estimate.
okay, we'll go that route then.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll get an estimate to Matt tomorrow.
Okay, perfect.
Sam?
Matt?
I can show you basically what the impact will be on the 2021 and 2022 rates, just like I have on the capital schedule. And as you posed a question right before you got into this details about which streets to do, you can certainly also choose not to include that in the bond financing, but rather use existing fund balance reserves for that portion of the project. So
Tax adjustment, but yeah.
Yep.
Okay, so Pleasant Street, that was just from basically, it was just the upper half. So
Yeah, where we left off last summer, back to Elm Street, which is just beyond, a little bit beyond East Street, probably 50 feet or 100 feet past Elm Street.
okay.
I mean, East Street, excuse me.
So what are we thinking on that one?
It's been in rough shape for a couple of years.
There's a lot of ruts.
Yeah, and it'd be nice to keep it the same timeline or close to the rest of the street.
All right,
And it's
finish
the
what you
same-
started.
Okay. I agree with you guys on that. That way not half the road's busted up in 6 years and the other half's brand new.
Right.
Okay, so let's keep that one in there. And then Church in Bismarck. I don't know about that one. Bismarck looked fine to me, for sure. And Church wasn't that bad,
Yeah,
I think.
I think church between St. Albans and Pearl could use some work, but the rest of it, I don't think.
That was my observation as well.
All right, so you're thinking that definitively there's an expiration difference between both sides of the road. Say if we do between St. Albans and Pearl, across the street for the remaining Church Street and Bismarck wouldn't have to be done for at least 3-4 more years after. Because that's kind of what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
So do you want me to do an estimate for that too, Sam?
I guess split it, yeah.
I'll just do lower Church between St. Albans and Pearl.
And that's where the new sidewalks are going too, so
That's correct.
kind of work together.
Spruce up the neighborhood.
Projects though, because then, I mean, right here is just a really small example of that. But like, say we were to do all of the roads within 5 years, A, it'd be really expensive, but B, it would just be it'd be just a cycle of the tax rate going up for a decade and then kind of down for an extended period of time. So I like to spread the roads out as much as we can.
That's fine.
Okay, so it sounds like we have an agreement on Lower Church. We're gonna do all Depot, and then the Missisquoi extension, and that's it. Or sorry, Upper
Pearl. Upper Pearl, right?
Pleasant.
I mean Pleasant. I'm sorry, Pleasant. Yes.
And we have an excess of general funds. And if we can find a project, I would say one of our least expensive projects, maybe we can fund it from general fund. So I don't know if it would be worth that looking at whenever you get those figures back, just taking the least expensive option and kind of budgeting that towards using some existing funds.
I'm going to guess that probably that Pleasant Street would probably be the lowest one, I think. Wasn't that 53,000 or something like that? 52, 53?
53, yeah. No, that's what I was thinking, Gary, too. That's probably going to end up being the least expensive.
expensive.
Of these.
Well, when you get done making changes to Church and Missisquoi, they'll all be
Yeah,
probably in the same
yeah.
ballpark.
Probably.
Mine is, Sam, I don't think you have to designate which particular street is being paid from reserve. What you can do is decide that you only want to put out a request for bond financing of X number of dollars, and the remainder would be funded through a deficit from unrestricted fund reserves.
Wouldn't we need to figure that out before we close our budget?
Absolutely. So basically what you can decide is we want to, if the total project now, instead of 525, let's say it comes down to 375,000, and you want to use 75 from reserves and only do bond financing for 300,000, for instance, as an example, you can decide what portion of that project you want funded by the new bond issue and at what portion you want to take out of reserves.
Okay.
What the new total is.
Okay, well, that sounds good to me, and I guess we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. That way we can kind of cut one of those other ones out of our 2020 budget. Okay, that was it, and then we'll keep the sidewalk. That one's also being funded. And then that was it for general fund projects, right?
Yep.
Mhm.
Yep, I think we're through that now.
On the bottom of this graph, we're going to be moving that 20,000 appropriated. We're going to be using unrestricted funds to make up the
Correct.
on that. So that also will be affected.
Yep.
Well, out, and then reduced. Yeah. Okay. We'll see what.
Okay, so we'll bring back drafts on all of our funds to you guys next week, so you can look at those again and see what your feelings are, see if it's getting closer to what you'd like to see overall. So that was general fund. We still got a few more to get through tonight, or we don't have to get through all of them if the board would prefer not to, but two of them I think are pretty much set, at least I think, as I said, in water and wastewater departments. Do you guys want to talk about the electric department?
I think we should go electric. I think just water and wastewater just basically need to be reviewed for minuscule changes before we approve them. So we can go over those later.
Yeah, I would agree with you, Sam. I think they're pretty well set. There's maybe some small changes that might need to be made in them, but they're, pretty small, insignificant, I would say.
Okay, let's go with electric then.
Okay.
So going back to the original memo, oops, wrong one. The only other thing other than the items that I mentioned earlier when we talked about the general fund that was a kind of a staff update was there was a slight adjustment to depreciation for both the electric and wastewater funds. And that was based on adding the depreciation for the new assets that we expected to acquire in 2021 from our capital projects list. That had a relatively small impact. I think it was less than $2,000 for the electric department. And if we go to the updated totals, the report that you have in your hands had a $276,948 operating deficit for the electric fund. That was up $1,000 from the first draft you looked at. Went back down $400 with those changes that I mentioned regarding the new handling of PTO from the auditors. So that one hasn't moved in a dramatic amount in any direction. So you're basically looking at the same situation that you were with your first draft for the electric department. The biggest difference being whether or not we can successfully tap into our line of credit to help recover some of the cash flow that has gone out to date and will go out in 2021 for the FERC relicensing. I'm waiting to hear back from FEPSA staff about what details we have to make sure are in place in advance with the Department of Public Service to make sure that we do that financing correctly so that it won't be disregarded in any future rate cases. So Steve Farman is working on that, and I hope to hear something back from him in the next several days. The other, I guess, question that we left off with in our first draft review was whether or not we were going to actively pursue another rate adjustment for 2021. Staff's recommendation at our last drafting was that it was prudent to evaluate that and explore it with VEPSA. we're very close to having some final 2020 numbers that we can let VEPSA start to do a draft case scenario for what that rate case might look like for 2021 to get us back in line with our current operating expenses and revenue recovery. So those are the only two, I think, open-ended questions that I knew hadn't been answered in our last discussion on this fund.
Okay, and you're still waiting to hear back from VEPSA.
Yeah, kind of VEPSA is a driving point for both of those. One, verifying for sure that their purchase power number they gave us is solid and that that's not going to move. Verifying that we can access our line of credit in an appropriate fashion that the department will approve and take into consideration those debt service costs for a rate case, and then getting a draft kind of what if scenario. If we filed a rate case in 2021, what would it look like? How much of an increase would that impact our ratepayers?
Okay, so what action would you like from us tonight? Should we budget for worst case scenario being they don't get back to us in time and we have to make it ourselves?
I guess the question to the board is whether or not you want to make any other operational changes to try and lower this $276,000 deficit, or whether or not you're comfortable with moving forward with that, with the idea that we're going to address our cash flow issues with these other two methodologies.
Somebody was supposed to get in touch with, what was that called? It was basically like how efficient the lines are.
An engineer.
Power factor.
Power factor, yes. Was there any news on that?
Gary, are you able to speak toward that, or John?
My knowledge, there's not been any movement with that, but you board might recall, I wasn't actually present during that conversation. You guys remember I got dropped from the middle of the meeting because my computer decided it was going to reboot itself. And so I missed about 10 minutes of the electric department discussion. And when I got rebooted back on, you guys were talking about power factor, but you were sort of concluding the discussion. And I didn't want to stop the meeting and say, you know, can you guys fill me in on the last 10 minutes of what you've been talking about? So I just let you kind of go on with it. But I sort of got caught up to speed from Dave, Westcom, and Matt as to what happened during that discussion. And my one response about that is I just want to caution the board that the power factor issue isn't going to significantly impact the budget in any meaningful way. So my understanding is David's brought it up to the board as a way to sort of make the electric department more efficient and a little leaner, and also attempt to maybe capture some additional revenues. But what you're going to get back from that is really pretty small in terms of the overall deficit that we're looking for in the department. So I just want to, you know, throw that out there to you guys, that although it's true there are some issues with power factor, I wouldn't consider them to be a significant part of the solution as to how we're going to overcome the deficit that we're looking at right now in this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see a reflection of us cleaning up our power factor even to 100% in this year, because it's not going to happen that fast anyway. But
right,
years it will have an impact.
Right. And even if you did clean it up significantly, you're not going to overcome a $200,000 deficit. You're just not going to. So anyway, because I missed that part of the discussion, I wasn't sure exactly what was said. And after I talked with Dave and Matt, I would just share that as my 2 cents on that subject. But we can look into it. Dave is aware that you guys want that research done, and I know he's got some people in mind that he's going to talk to about that.
Matt, did you have anything in mind in particular for something that stands out as a big operating cost that we can clean up?
I think the only thing that I would suggest that might help the operating deficit, it won't change your cash flow situation. Some of the projects that are being done under the line maintenance, let me get up here to, whoops. Sorry, I'm having trouble finding the section. Infrastructure. So we have $50,000 earmarked for maintenance of lines. A portion of that is the necessary cost to maintain the existing condition of the lines and make sure that they remain functional during the course of the year, responding to environmental conditions, etc. Some of it is to do some upgrades, some reconductoring in certain portions of the distribution network. From a technical standpoint, those things that are upgrades that either improve the function of the distribution network or extend its life can be properly reclassified as capital. They come out of the operating expense, they come out of the operating deficit. They still cost money. They're still going to impact your fund balance, but then they would be depreciated over the lifetime of those upgrades. So in the case of reconductoring on Boston Post Road, that might extend the life of that portion of the distribution network by 20 or 30 years. You might depreciate that expenditure over that time period. In the long run, it still comes out of your operating expense, but it comes out more slowly instead of a lump sum upfront when you do the work. Again, it's not going to make the deficit go away. It'll lower the deficit, increase your depreciation in future years, and in turn, get us closer in line with the revenue recognition that we're currently capturing with our current rate case baseline. Because instead of showing this as an operating expense all up front when the work is conducted, it would be spread out over the lifetime of the upgrade. I really need to sit with Dave and get a methodology for properly classifying those projects that he works on each year and identifying what are capital upgrades versus what are maintenance and operating upkeep. And that's something that he and I need to sit down and start to develop an approach when he's identifying a project to determine whether it's capital or operating. And then we can make those proper reclassifications. There's no other single line items that are significant other than perhaps what we spend on tree trimming. You can't really go after that one because we have some requirements in our IRP with the department to meet a certain amount of tree trimming miles on an annual basis. So that's not an item that you can cut without some consequences.
Now, is that an internal thing? We trim our own trees, correct?
We do some of it with our staff and we do some of it with a contractor.
Yeah, but we actually do most of it with a contractor.
Does it need to be contracted to make up your mileage?
Yeah, our staff can't do the amount of miles that are required with
It's 4.1.
not and do these other upgrade projects that they've been tackling.
It's 4.1 miles, Sam, a year they want us to cut.
Right, that's the state, the Public Utility Commission, that in our IRP, our Integrated Resource Plan, which is something we have to file periodically with the PUC, that is what they have requested us to do on an annual basis, and it's proving to be a fairly substantial amount of work to get that number of mileage done every year in tree trimming. So we have been subcontracting most of that out over the last couple of years. But I basically can concur with Matt's conclusions to you. There's no silver bullet in the electric department that any of us can see that's going to significantly drive down that operating budget.
Not without affecting service quality.
Okay. So yeah, I guess we'll just wait to hear back from VEPSA and do what we can as far as getting the funds that we need for right now, and then hopefully getting recognized for that if a rate increase does occur.
This is the first year we met the 4.1 miles. This is the first year.
What happens if you don't?
Well, that's a good question. Technically, they can fine us. We've never, in all honesty, though, I don't even know what the fine would be. They have fined us in the past for duration of power being out to particular customers. But it didn't end up being a lot of money. I think the 2 times that happened, it ended up being around $2,000 was the total amount on the fine. And actually they can't do that to us anymore, not for power outages, because of the way that our tariff is now written. We changed the way our tariff is written, and it now states that if the department or the PUC does fine us for duration of a power outage related item, we just fine ourselves. Basically, we take the money that we would have paid back to the state or another community organization, and we put it into our tree trimming fund in the electric department. So the money actually stays within our department now. Whether they would do that for this same type of situation or not, I don't know. We haven't had to experience that yet.
Right. The only reason why I asked is $30,000 for 4.1 miles, and that's like $8,000 a mile or something like that. And I would assume that once we get all the stuff cut back from the lines, then it wouldn't be hard to maintain it. And I didn't know whose discretion the cutting or how the mileage is calculated, whether it's, clear cutting or trimming or maintenance or something, And
So that annual mileage is based on completing the entire system cycle once every 5 years. So
Okay.
after you've done 4 miles for 5 years in a row, the idea is you're going back to the beginning and doing that first run of 4 miles again in your
Right.
6th year.
I can
That's-
understand that, but I wouldn't imagine that trees would get to the size where they would need to be, cut down with a chainsaw. It'd be more or less brush at that point, a 5-year-old tree.
Yeah, that's the PUC wanted us to get on a standard cycle so that we're periodically hitting every section of line that needs it. Not all of our lines need to be trimmed. In fact, in the village, there's very little line that needs to get trimmed because it's mostly paved. All of the areas where our lines run through village property, it's next to the sidewalk or next to the road, and there's very little in the village. It's all out in the rural parts of our service territory.
Mostly East Bakersfield and John, Lower Bakersfield, East Bakersfield, that way, I think is.
Yeah, out in that area, we've got miles and miles and miles of line that run cross country, as it's referred to, meaning it just goes out into the middle of the woods, and you might have a mile of line going through the middle of nowhere with one house at the end of that line. And we've got a lot of that in that area of our service territory. That's kind of the southeastern section of our service territory.
So that item can't really be adjusted to make up any deficit.
I wouldn't recommend it. We really need to try and meet this goal that the PUC has set out for us. If we don't meet it, the next time they review our IRP, they're probably going to just make things very difficult for us. We don't know what that'll be exactly, but they've made it pretty clear to us, not just us, but all of the utilities, electric utilities in the state, that they want all of the lines in the state of Vermont to get regular tree trimming to prevent power outages.
Okay. Was there anything else for electric, or did that kind of sum everything up?
I think that pretty well summed it up. You know, as Matt said, we got 2 methodologies that we're still working on, capitalizing those expenses related to the FERC licensing process. And we're also, you know, hoping that the final power supply numbers from VEPSA might change, but they're probably not going to change a whole lot at this point, but there might still be some savings. And yeah, when we get the final numbers, we'll let you guys know. We'll give you an updated budget next week for all of the departments so you can see where we stand.
And those should be almost ready for approval. At least wastewater and water.
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you wanted to look at wastewater and water tonight, I don't expect those numbers to move, and they're very close to what you saw in the first draft. And if you wanted to take action and approve those budgets tonight, you could do that.
Yeah, if you want to, we can run through them quick. If they do change at all, I think we would have to wait to approve them after the final change.
They might change a little bit. It's not going to be a lot, but there might be a little bit of change.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have anything remaining on my radar for that. All the items that I knew might change have, and they're reflected in what
Oh,
I
you
have
did.
tonight.
You did get them all in there for right now.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought there was still a couple of things
Yeah.
from the auditors that you hadn't quite got in there yet. But if you're good, then yeah, maybe that's something you guys want to do tonight
will.
too.
Review and approve wastewater and water while we're right here.
If you
At least
like.
not. Sure.
Let me pull up on the screen for you water. So I'm going right to the bottom line. Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see it, Matt.
So when you last looked at this, we had a $993 deficit for the water department. That's grown a little bit, $500. Same with the fund deficit. And I'd answer any questions you might have about what drove that.
Yeah, where'd that come from?
So combination of the things we've talked about earlier. We've got the update to the printing and public notices, the small adjustments, principal and interest, the communications portion of the FCC license, the portion of the Harris maintenance contract, workers' comp was updated, and the that was it that affected water. So
And there's plenty enough in the account to make up that deficit.
yeah, we're carrying around a $200,000 fund reserve.
Should be good then.
Yep.
All right. So I need a motion to accept water fund as drafted.
Make the motion.
Before we go into, is that how I want to word that, John? Just for legality's sake.
Yeah, I think that's fine, Sam.
Okay, Heather with the first. Do I have a second?
I second.
Cindy with a second. All those in favor of accepting water fund, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. All right, we got one fund done.
Yay.
Wastewater fund. So we were looking at a $4,900 operating surplus at first draft. We're now looking at $3,600, so we're down about $1,300. Similar change. Well, actually, let's see, the adjustments moved. Oh, yeah, because depreciation, a good portion of that increase was the extra dollars that I put in for depreciation, which don't affect the fund balance. So we actually improved about $700 in fund balance while we lost $1,300 in operating. surplus.
And that was from the same,
Same minor adjustments. There was a little bit of a tweak to the premium for the pollution policy for the wastewater fund. We got the actual bill from that. That was, I don't know, it was less than $100 more than what we had originally estimated in the first draft.
it's very small changes.
Yeah, the majority of this change was that update that I made to depreciation, where you can see it went up about $1,900.
Okay, if the board doesn't have any questions, I'll hear a motion to accept wastewater fund as written.
A motion to accept.
Jason with first,
I'll second that.
Leonard with the second. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right, we got half of them done.
That's right. Very good.
So if I can summarize real quick, with the electric fund, the only changes that we will make will be driven by updates we get from VEPSA. And if we're going to include an amount still for this power factor engineering analysis under the capital projects, or no?
We can get it in time. If they won't get an estimate to us in time for budgeting, that's not something that will be affected this year as far as improvements. But yeah, if they get it to us in time, great. Let's see if we can include it, and that may be able to be covered under a rate increase as well. I don't know if you want to check on that.
Yeah, that'll most certainly be a capitalized expense, and tied with any improvements that come out of that study. So for instance, if the analysis says you should add the following equipment in this area of your system to help improve power factor, or you should add this type of metering with these customers so that you can meter and charge them a power factor surcharge. Those actual implementation costs will be tied to the engineering study costs and then capitalized for the reasonable life period of the value of those improvements to the system.
Okay.
Obviously, the goal being that they have some positive impact on revenue recovery.
Yep. And if they don't, if the engineering says they don't, then it's a wash. But yeah, okay. So yeah, if they get it in time, then we'll include that.
All right, and then with the general fund, I have instructions to remove the 20K equipment appropriation and recast that as a transfer to savings. To remove Missisquoi and replace that with just an estimate for lower Missisquoi, without at least giving you the cost if you were to finance that, but not necessarily putting it on a capital list. And then adjusting Church Street to remove the northern portion in Bismarck. Gary will get me updated estimates for those, and we'll update the capital schedule. And then the board can make a determination if what portion of that they would like to fund from fund reserves as opposed to bond proceeds.
Okay, if we're including those other two smaller projects, you might as well throw Missisquoi tail end in. That way we can just pick one. And
okay,
because if we leave it out, then we kind of have to finance that from funds.
Did I miss anything? Oh, and Sam, you wanted me to take a look at what rate impact there might be from doing some early debt service retirement with some of those reserve funds.
Yeah, feel free to play around with some numbers. There's a lot of unallocated or unrestricted funds there. So if we can keep that fund at 75,000 or around, and then transfer, maybe get a timeline or some sort of a graduated payment schedule for debt service. I know it's a lot to ask for, but if you.
Yeah, I can play some what if scenarios and give the board an idea. If you were to set aside this much money each year over the next X number of years for early debt service retirement, this is what it would do to the future tax rate.
Yep, I think that sounds good.
Okay. That's the summary of the notes that I had for adjustments. Did I miss anything?
Nothing here. Anybody else?
I think you did a good job, Matt.
Okay, very good. so I guess that will conclude budget discussions, unless anybody else has anything. Good, because I'm all budget too.
Yeah, that's all we had tonight. It was basically just to go through the budget stuff, and then we had the conversation with Andy about ballots and mail outs.
And the request for dedication.
Right, and Heather is going to draft something for next week. She said
Mhm.
she would share with folks,
Yes.
and I think we're good. Got another meeting next week. Remember, the 26th. That's a regular meeting, so there will be some other agenda items besides budget, but we will also have budget again on the agenda next week.
Okay, sounds good. Is there any other business?
I was just curious about the power outage today.
Yeah, boy, that was a surprise, huh?
Yeah.
kind of an unpleasant one. What happened was, I'll take a step back a little bit. I don't know. Some of our newer board members may not realize we are fed by another electric company. All of the excess power that we do not generate within our system, which is most of our power needs. And that electric utility is Vermont Electric Co-op. They are our transmission provider. That's the term that is used to reference someone that brings in power to another distribution utility, which is what we're known as, a distribution utility. And our main line that feeds into our switching station, which is over on at the end of Birch Lane. If people know where that is, that's that big giant substation looking thing at the end of Birch Lane. That's our switching station where all of our transmission comes in from Vermont Electric Co-op. And that main line that feeds that switching station is coming from a much larger sub in Highgate. And VEC's line from that Highgate sub experienced some problems. I have not gotten the final report from VEC as to what happened, but something happened to their transmission line at the Highgate sub, and it dropped not only the electric part of our services, but the fiber optic line dropped as well. And when that happened, the automatic recloser that is supposed to set our distribution in from a second service that comes out of Richford did not happen. This automatic recloser is supposed to kick in if that Highgate line goes down. We'd still have an outage, but it would only be for like 10 seconds. And then there's supposed to be an automatic system that would refeed us in from a sub in Richford. So it'd be a very small outage. Because that fiber optic line was also damaged by whatever took down the line in Highgate, that automatic system did not work. And so we did not get fed in from Richford. And VEC had to send some men out to, figure out what happened. We were, as a result, our entire service territory was down for about an hour. We were down too. We had no power down at the office or anywhere. No one in our service territory had power for about an hour. Luckily, it wasn't any longer than that. We were able to at least keep the phone lines going through a backup generating system we have here. And we were able to at least take calls from customers and did our best to explain to them what was going on with the limited knowledge we had. But fortunately, it wasn't any longer than that. We have had times, I can tell you, where VEC dropped us. And boy, I'll tell you, when I first came here back in 2004, 2005, 2006, sometimes when they would drop us, we would be out for 5-6 hours, our whole service territory. And after about 4 years of griping and complaining and writing letters to the general manager of VEC, they finally invested the money to update that switching station. That was the whole problem, was that switching station at the end of Birch Lane was so old and decrepit. You know, every time the wind blew more than 25 miles an hour, something crashed in that station, and it would take them forever to troubleshoot it, fix it, and put it back up. And there was no other rerouting, no automatic rerouting system in place at that time either. So I remember those days too, and I don't ever want to go back to those days again where our whole system crashes for 5 or 6 hours because VEC can't, you know, deal with their switching station. But at least that was only an hour. That was bad enough, I understand, and we did apologize to our customers, and hopefully we don't have that situation again. I did speak directly with Rebecca Town, who's the manager for Vermont Electric Co-op during the outage, and she told me she would get me a final report. They would troubleshoot what happened with that fiber optic line to prevent it from automatically rerouting over to the Richford sub. And if they can identify what that problem was, they would try to get a resolution to it. So at least that problem doesn't happen again.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. It was at least warmer than it was this morning when the power went out.
Yes.
It only got like marginally cold in the house. So
Yeah. Understand it was a cold day too. So I
Yeah.
know everybody was a little uncomfortable and on edge when all of a sudden the power crashed.
yeah, we made the best of it at our house and went outside, enjoyed the sun. But
I like the attitude, Heather. That's
Yeah.
excellent.
yeah, well, thank you.
All right, anybody else got business? If we don't, then I'll hear a motion to adjourn.
I'll make
A
the
motion
motion.
to adjourn.
Not everybody at once now. Come on, Ryan.